Thanks, Helen. Thanks, everyone. Again, my name is Zach Barber. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm the Clean Air Advocate with Penn Environment, which is a statewide environmental advocacy group. And I'm really excited to be working here in Pittsburgh on environmental issues because, like so many of us, this is a personal issue here for me. Right, I grew up going to visit my grandmother out in McKees Rocks a lot, which meant a lot of time driving by Neville Island. And when I was growing up, there was a big steel factory there called the Shenango Coke Works. And I remember being like 5 years old, not being an environmentalist, not having any idea what was going on, and looking out the window and seeing this big thing, spewing these big clouds of like sometimes weirdly colored smoke. And I was like, look, Mom, it's a cloud factory. And I was really excited because like when you're a kid, that stuff's really cool. But I remember my mom being a little bit less excited about what was going on there. And I would grow up and find out that it was it was pumping out just tons of really dangerous pollution. And when it closed a few years ago, we actually saw about a 30% reduction in ER visits for asthma in the communities around that plant. And so that was a real eye-opener for me, that these things that we grow up with, just literally in our backyards in many cases, or next to where we're going to school, or where we visit our families, or where we work, these things are doing real and harmful things to our bodies and to the health of our community. And here in Allegheny County, like Rachel was saying, we have some of the worst health outcomes from air pollution. We're in the worst 2% of the country for cancer risk from air pollution, which means that breathing here is more likely to give you cancer than pretty much anywhere else in the country. And when we look at where that industrial air pollution is coming from in Allegheny County, about 70% of it is coming from just 10 sources, which we've identified as the toxic 10. And so think about that. That is literally hundreds of tons of pollution, about 1 million pounds per year from just 10 facilities. So if we could clean up these 10 facilities, that would be one of the largest pieces of the pie that is making us sick. And so what we are working on is going after these facilities and using simple common sense tools like the Clean Air Act to rein in the dangerous industrial pollution that is coming from these sources. Here in Allegheny County, we have local control over the Clean Air Act, which means the agency that we need to convince to go out and tackle this pollution is not the EPA, right? We don't have to deal with the Trump administration too much, thankfully. It's not the DEP. We don't have the state's Department of Environmental Protection. We don't have to compete with 67 counties or 66 other counties to get our own attention. Nope, we have one local agency that is supposed to be protecting our health and taking on these polluters. And much like Neil was saying when he was starting, we've known the broad strokes of this for decades. It was true on climate science. It's here true with air pollution. You can go back and watch the videos of GASP saying these exact same things 50 years ago. I recommend it. It's prophetic, right? So the problem isn't that we haven't known. The problem is that our leaders don't want to listen. And so it's not a scientific problem, it's not a technical problem, it's not a legal problem. We know where the pollution's coming from, we have the legal tools to stop it, but we need to build the political will to go after these big, powerful companies who are pumping out tons of dangerous pollution that is linked to all sorts of dangerous stuff. And that's, especially here in Pittsburgh, right, where things like US Steel are so foundational for identity, that can be a little bit of a heavy lift. But we know that in 2020, it's kind of ridiculous that we're even letting these facilities continue to operate in such a way where just business as usual is putting people's health at risk and is, for instance, giving kids twice as much asthma as other places in the country. And so that's why we've been working to mobilize Pittsburghers across the region to speak out on this campaign to get our leaders to listen. The person who we're targeting here is the Allegheny County Executive, Rich Fitzgerald. He is basically the head of the executive branch of the government, oversees a lot of what goes on, appoints the people who are the bosses of the health department, right? And he's an elected official. He cares what we think, and we have some influence over him through the political and electoral process, right? So Rich Fitzgerald is the man we need to kind of convince to crack down on this stuff. So for the last few years, with a lot of help from groups like GASP and Clean Air Council, who we'll be hearing from a little bit later tonight, right, we've been working to mobilize the public to tell the county executive to crack down on these polluters. So I remember back in 2018, about every twice a month, we were going right outside the office of the county executive and saying, hey, Rich Fitzgerald, we need you to rein in pollution from U.S. Steel. We need you to crack down on other illegal polluters around the county. And as a result, thank you, of this type of effort, we've started to see a little bit of movement, things starting to move a little bit more in the right direction. Over the last few years, we've seen a record fine against U.S. Steel, a $1 million fine for just a few months of violations. We've seen strengthened enforcement policies and another number of other things. We also just know there's so much more work that still needs to be done. And so there are about 4 kind of simple common sense things that we're asking Rich Fitzgerald and the Allegheny County Health Department to do to really tackle these polluters. First, we need to make sure that every polluter has an up-to-date Clean Air Act permit, right? It might seem a little hard to believe, but many of the facilities who are most putting our health at risk either don't have the correct permit or they have the correct permit, but it's expired. And so for this, I think there's a steel facility in the north of the county called ATI Brackenridge. It's a stainless steel facility, and for about 20 years, they have not had the type of Clean Air Act operating permit that they're supposed to have. And yet they have been operating that entire time. So can you imagine if I were driving for 20 years without a driver's license, and if I were doing things like hurting people with my driving, and the authorities knew that I didn't have my driver's license, do you think that they would be okay with that? Do you think, I would be allowed to continue to get behind the wheel of a car? No, it's pretty astounding that we're letting these big polluters get away with it. So first, we need to make sure that everybody has the correct and up-to-date permit. And 2, those permits only are effective if they have strong and health-based pollution limits. So we need to not just give them blanket permission to pollute. We need to set really strict, strong, enforceable pollution limits that put health first and not just polluter profit. And Rachel's example of all the hydrogen sulfide we're breathing is an interesting example because the U.S. Steel Clarendon Coke Works is legally allowed to release all of that hydrogen sulfide that we are smelling all across the region. And they can do that without even violating the law. That's absurd, right? They shouldn't be allowed to do that. And it gets even worse when you consider something like benzene, which also comes out of the plant. It's a potent carcinogen. The World Health Organization says there's no safe amount of benzene to breathe. And yet, the U.S. Steel Clarendon Coke Works is permitted to release tons of it every single year, literally. And so if we want to go about cleaning up these polluters, we have to start by giving them really strict health-based pollution limits. Third, we need monitoring to know where this pollution is coming from, because all too often, when we can identify that there is a problem, that there is pollution, those in power will say, well, we don't know where it's coming from. We've seen, for instance, in the case of Lawrenceville, where a local steel facility was releasing really dangerous amounts of a neurotoxin. It was actually, when we wanted to go about getting that cleaned up, the thing we had was a chart of data of how much of this dangerous neurotoxin was coming out of the plant. And so if we can't see that type of data, we don't know what's going up our nose, and we don't then know where to focus our efforts to fight that problem. So we need enough monitoring to be able to identify these problems when they pop up. And then fourth and finally, when we have these great pollution limits, when we are monitoring what's going on, when we catch someone breaking the rules, we need to go after them and hold them accountable. And without strong enforcement, pretty much the rest of it doesn't even matter. And so what we've seen for decades is companies like U.S. Steel will be able to break the law and get away with no more than a slap on the wrist. And we need to turn that around and make sure that it doesn't pay to pollute here in Allegheny County. And so to make all of these things happen, the really important thing is that we speak out, we tell our elected officials, we tell the county executive that it is time that we are able to breathe here in Allegheny County without putting our health at risk. And we need to mobilize a grassroots public pressure campaign to crack down on the toxic 10 to ultimately get the clean air that we deserve. Thanks.